At Riverside County, we've rolled out an effort to really try to change how we do business. And I know all of you here representing various government entities, you've probably heard the question, why can't government operate like businesses? And, well, heck, we're not businesses, but why can't we do that? Why can't we function that way? Why can't we take the data that we can gather and measure it and say, well, we invested in this or we invested in that. What kind of results did we get? If we're not measuring that outcome, then in a sense, aren't we kind of wasting our investment? So what we're starting to look at throughout all of our departments is what kind of return on investment can we get? I think we'll have a very exciting panel discussion, and I'm going to allow our panelists to introduce themselves a little further, but at the table right now we have Daniela Urbina, we have Christy Madden, and Jake Siegel, and when they begin their dialogue, I'm going to let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what their background is. I have a couple of things I want to mention for Riverside County and what we're trying to do, and I want to kind of focus on two areas, just general information and CSI insights for our county homeless programs, CSI being our cross-system integration. In Riverside County, we have approximately 2,400 homeless with over 100 homeless programs and efforts across many counties. Now, I'm not going to be redundant and repeat what's been talked about already. Just about every county has some level of continuum of care. I sit on our Board of Governance for Riverside County COC, and I think we're all familiar with how that operates and what the structure is that HUD puts on COCs and how we are to measure our success, how we are to spend our money by comparison to what Los Angeles County has to invest in homelessness. Our amount is very small, $14 million. And there's not a lot we can do with that, but we do combine some of that funding with Housing Authority funding through our EDA. And so we get a little bit more of an outcome. But certainly, I think the first step for us has been to create this plan, this program, that we can start focusing on the things that we want to achieve in outcomes. And so in Riverside County, we've focused on 5 next steps to enhance our countywide homeless approach. 1, strike team pilots, county homeless pilots in multiple departments working together with the cities to use strike teams going out to areas with large homelessness and homeless populations to identify the homeless individuals and provide them with housing. I think we heard a very good description from the lieutenant from Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. I was very impressed with their outreach, with their interaction with the homeless, and also with the description of they are collaborators. They are not the solution to homelessness. They are there to provide a path from homelessness into the services that are going to be provided to the homeless. Number 2, wraparound services. Number 3, proactive identification. Number 4, data and information sharing. And number 5, virtual application and access. So that's the structure of the program that we're trying to implement. And I think we're going to start seeing better outcomes, at least with the structure in place for Riverside County. So, since I'm losing my voice, I might as well let somebody else talk.
Got a couple of things for you. Thing 1 is we're going to tell you a little bit about Pay for Success, which is a innovative financing tool that we developed about a decade ago and are working with a variety of different jurisdictions around the country to put into use. And Christy is going to give you an example of this happening right now in Ventura County. Danielle is going to give you another one in Denver. And then we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about how some of the tools and mechanisms of pay for success apply outside of these performance-based contracts. I'll give you a little bit of preview of that, and Danielle will give you some more. All right. We've talked a lot about homelessness today, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I think the short version of this is homelessness is tricky. It's tricky in lots of ways. One of the ways in which it's tricky is it touches every system that we all work on, right? And it creates cost to a lot of those different systems, right? So those costs are often diffuse, but the ability to prevent homelessness is often concentrated. And that dynamic, I think, creates these challenging and pernicious cycles of problems that we all face. Those things kind of ripple out throughout our ability to actually counteract homelessness. And one of those challenges is that homelessness is just hard, right? Solutions are often not very obvious. We have lots of ideas around the table, but this is one of the more challenging social problems that we face. At the same time, there's often just not enough money for prevention. We spend so much time on remediation and on the emergency challenges that keep all of us busy that it's hard to scour up the dollars to spend on prevention, even though Ben Franklin made the point a few hundred years ago that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. At the same time, not everyone is doing equally well, right? This is a reality that I think we all have to face, that different providers and different interventions have different levels of impact. And if you have a question about that or you don't agree, we should come back to it. And frankly, we don't always know exactly what's effective. And I want to underscore this because one of the things that we do is we bring together a variety of different worlds. One of those worlds is the evaluation research world. And there's a thing called I was talking about this over dinner last night, the iron law of evaluation. Has anyone heard of this thing? The iron law of evaluation is that the expected impact of any large-scale social program is zero. Just let that sink in for a minute. If you think about the many, many randomized controlled trials that we've done in the social sector, the vast majority of them don't demonstrate impact on the outcomes that they're testing. And those are often the good ones, right? So oftentimes we just don't know as much as we think that we know. You've heard a lot about the challenges that providers face, but oftentimes they don't know how they're doing because we don't give them enough access to the kinds of data they would need in order to track their own outcomes. At the same time, they have tricky financial incentives, and many of us do, to navigate, right? So it might not always make sense for them to not have a full shelter. And finally, this last point that I mentioned on the last slide. Costs are diffuse, especially in homelessness, across many different pockets, but we often expect a single agency or a single silo to be the one to invest in prevention. Okay, so those are all the challenges that we face, among many others. One mechanism that we're starting to think about in order to counteract some of those challenges is the idea that I've mentioned before, pay for success. This thing at its core is a three-way performance-based contract. It starts with an outcomes payer, and typically this is government of some form. An outcomes payer who identifies a set of policy challenges that are often pernicious, often long-term, and challenging to move the needle on. They've identified those challenges, and then we'll work together to identify what are the outcomes that we would have to actually move the needle on in order to claim some kind of success. How would we measure those outcomes over what period of time? And then what is the measurement methodology that we would use in order to know if we've succeeded or not? And ultimately, how valuable are those outcomes? Once we do all of that work, we'll go out and see if there are actually undervalued interventions out there that we think if we were to invest in these things, it would create that positive downstream preventative impact. And if we're successful at matching up those two components of it, then groups like mine will go out and try to find folks who will put up the money, the working capital to scale up those preventative interventions. So we walk through that again. The way that this works is we kind of bind together these three different parties in a contract. The outcomes payer sets which outcomes they care about and how they'll measure them and how valuable they are. A nonprofit will actually provide services funded by some independent third party, often a mix of philanthropy and other impact investors. And then only to the extent that they're successful will that outcomes payer repay the funders. All right, we're going to give you a few examples of this, but before I do, I want to just talk a little bit about why we care about this thing at all. All right, one is that it helps us refocus on what are what is the evidence that can actually drive effective proposive social interventions? And then what are the outcomes that we care about in measuring those things? And it actually forces us to do all of those things, right? It actually forces us to measure things and to act on that measurement. At the same time, it brings together these other different stakeholders that can get around the problems of kind of not having enough money for prevention, and that can hold all of us accountable in a contractual fashion around whether or not we're achieving the success that we hope we will. This is still a pretty young idea. So my organization is a nonprofit. We were founded in the UK just over a decade ago and did the world's first one of these things in the Peterborough prison system in 2010. So it's 2018. The whole idea is less than 8 years old. And in the US, there have been, I think at this point, 21 of these projects going on around the country in a whole bunch of different issue areas. You'll see homelessness is up on the board, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's also taken root in the criminal justice system, which Christy will tell you a little bit more about, in workforce development, early childhood, and elsewhere. Christy's going to run you through the actual mechanics of one of these things. I just wanted to flash up here that this is the kind of pay for success graphic, and when Christy talks, you should keep that in mind. I also wanted to do the second half of what I promised I would do, which is talk about how some of these tools and mechanics have been working in jurisdictions around the country outside of just the pay for success mechanism. And I'll be very brief on this because Daniela will talk more about it. One of the things that we realized after doing this for 8 years, and this is a shockingly recent development, is that to actually put one of these things together actually requires many different things to all line up. So pay for success, increasingly, we're coming to see isn't one thing. It's about 15 things, right? This kind of layer cake on the left-hand side. And a lot of the work that we're doing is taking elements of that and working with jurisdictions to move them forward. So one example I'll mention briefly before I get hooked off the stage. We did some work with Sacramento County about a year ago, and a final report is coming out on it in the next week or two, around homelessness. And part of that work was helping to identify the current costs of homelessness to the city and county in Sacramento and what we might be able to do about it. So doing that intensive deep dive on evidence and what we can learn from it, and then applying the evidence to the existing cost to do a cost benefit. Stuff you've probably all seen before. So let me just flash up what that meant. It meant looking really carefully at which outcomes are stronger and weaker of a given intervention and being really careful about that intervention. Many of us here talk about permanent supportive housing as though it is one thing. But in reality, it's many things, right? The kinds of services we can match against permanent housing vary dramatically. And we talked about subpopulations. They apply differently for different subpopulations. So being really careful about the match between evidence, intervention, and target population. And then also being very candid about what we don't know, because this is a space that is not at the top tier of evidence among the various social programs we look at. It also means doing some of that kind of back-end data integration. You've probably seen slides like this before, but we worked in Sacramento to put together data from the HMIS system, along with anyone who had touched kind of jail bookings and jail days over the last 5 years, anyone who had been in the BHS system, and then various elements of the city's programs, especially the police impact team and their fire department, to identify, be able to create a graph that looks like this. What this is individuals on the each one of these columns, and on the y-axis here is the total average cost of those individuals to the city and county over 2015 and 2016. So it's average across those 2 years. And these are the top 250 highest cost individuals, again, to the city and county, broken out by each of the different kinds of service utilization categories. So you can see shelter costs, some of the behavioral health costs, some cost to the sheriff's department. And we can create these kind of interesting stacked bars to know exactly how much folks cost over what period of time and to which departments. I think my time is up. We will have time for Q&A, I'm sure, but in the meantime, let me pass it to Christy for a really specific example.
My name is Christy Madden, and I'm a Senior Deputy Executive Officer for the County of Ventura in the CEO's office. And while my primary job assignment isn't specifically related to the criminal justice field, I work primarily in homeless arena and dealing with HUD funding for people who are low income. I'll explain to you why I got involved with this project to begin with. Where this all began was AB 1837 by Tony Atkins, signed in 2014, and it created a social innovation financing program through the Board of State and Community Corrections. And it provided for about $5 million of funding to fund 3 pilot projects throughout the state of California. And in addition to the BSCC's stated goals, which you would expect to reduce recidivism and to direct funding to programs that have evidence-based success, and to promote the effective use of public resources. We in Ventura County have a successful program. It's an AB 109 program called Core Connection, and it is a program that deals with our AB 109 clients who are on formal probation. And what they do is they get catered programs and services to meet the needs to ensure their successful reintegration into the community. The problem is that only about 10% of all of those people in Ventura County on formal probation are eligible for the AB 109 services. So we saw this as an opportunity to expand the demonstration of this program and apply it to a BSCC grant. So in addition to the BSCC objectives that we already talked about, we wanted to demonstrate that pay for success could be used as an effective financing strategy to help fund these types of programs. We also wanted to try and gain support for some of these non-traditional types of service delivery. And I will tell you, we at the county level, and Jake will say otherwise, we're a little bit frustrated with the complications that we encountered in trying to implement and engage the policymakers in this type of a solution, because the long and the short of it is we weren't contracting for services, right? We had a contract with social finance as the intermediary who contracted with the service provider, and what we were contracting with social finance for was for outcomes. So we predefined what the outcomes were, and if we don't get the outcomes, we don't pay. So some of the things that we had to overcome were, well, what about, complying with our procurement criteria, because we're sole sourcing services to our local service provider, Interface Children and Family Services. And the argument is, no, we don't have a contract with Interface. We're contracting with social finance to pay for outcomes. So it was quite a learning experience and an education process. We were frustrated. Social finance said that we got through that process in record speed, but for us it was a little bit difficult. Okay. So here's the slide that I think this is the one that Jake flashed up on the board. So this is kind of the way the system flows, right? So social finance went out and raised $2.65 million. So we got a $1.5 million grant from the Board of State and Community Corrections. It had a 100% match requirement. So social finance went out and raised just over $2.6 million to implement the programs. Interface Children and Family Services is doing specialized service delivery for people who are selected through a randomized control trial. So our probation department identifies people who are eligible for the program, and they're not AB 109 clients, and they are asked, do you want to be considered for services under this new program? And if they say yes, then they are randomized. So that goes to Dr. David Farabee at UCLA, and he randomizes, and people either go for our reentry services under this program, or they get services as usual. So we have a treatment group and a control group. Okay, so Interface provides these services. They can range at about 9 months, roughly, of service delivery. And during that process, every quarter, we measure what we call clean quarters. So people who are in our treatment program, if they go for an entire quarter without getting rearrested, then that is an outcome payment. At the end of the cohort, we have 2 cohorts in this process. At the end of that term, we will evaluate what are the outcomes of our treatment group relative to our control group. And if there are improvements, there's another set of payments that go back to our investors. So it's a very scientifically accurate process through the randomized control trial. That was another little bit of a stumbling block with our county council and getting through the issues of some people get services, some people don't. But people who are not selected for treatment get business as usual. So the traditional services are available to everybody else. So these are some of the services that are being offered by Interface Children and Family Services. These are evidence-based services that they are currently implementing with our AB 109 clients. So it includes things like moral recognition therapy, family reunification, employment support, and trauma therapy services. Next slide. This is a very busy slide, but it's a 5-year grant. So as I indicated, we have 2 cohorts. The program was launched in November of 2017, so we are expecting in April we'll get the first results of the first cohort and whether we have clean quarters and whether payments are going to be going back to our investors. So we are very excited about this opportunity. I think that's all I have on my slides, and I'm going to pass the microphone. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniela Urbina and I am a Government Innovation Fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab. We are an organization that works with government agencies across the country to help improve outcomes for the social services that governments provide. We have 3 models of work, one being the pay-for-success model that Jake described. The second is results-driven contracting, and the third is kind of a wide bucket of just performance improvement, as we call it. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. One is our Denver Pay for Success project around permanent supportive housing. The second is the work that I'm currently doing with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority around active contract management. So our Denver Pay for Success project brought together 8 funders along with the city of Denver to help fund new permanent supportive housing units in Denver. The funders came with about $8.6 million, and we were able to build 160 new units of permanent supportive housing. The target population for this intervention was people who had been arrested at least 8 times in the past 3 years, with the understanding that this would save money by keeping people out of jail. So that was a major goal, showing that housing and intensive case management can improve the lives and reduce taxpayer costs, the taxpayer costs coming from reduction in jail time. So there were 2 outcomes that the funders were going to be paid for, assuming that they met the targets. One was housing stability, and the second was reduction in jail time. Housing stability was measured by the number of days that a participant was in housing minus any days that they spent in jail. And then the reduction in jail time was done through the randomized control trial that we worked with the Urban Institute to put together. So we were able, because there's a huge population that needs a service such as this, we did randomize people by a lottery to go into permanent supportive housing, and the jail reduction time would be a comparison between the 2 groups to see the % difference of time that each were spending in prison, or in jail, sorry, not prison. So yeah, I mean, these are just some other details. I'm not going to go through them too rigorously, but we were serving about somewhere between 250 and 300 chronically homeless individuals. There was 5 years of SIB, stands for Social Impact Bond, same thing as Pay for Success, it's just another term. And these are the services and the housing details that were provided. We're in about the 2nd year of this project as far as actually being able to house people, and if you go on the Urban Institute's website, you can just Google Urban Institute and Denver Pay for Success. There is a report on the first year's outcomes and how the program is doing. So far, it's been successful as far as keeping people in housing. They have about an 80 to 90% success rate of people staying in housing, and I think the national average is somewhere between 72 to 85. Don't quote me on that, I may be wrong, but definitely look up the Urban Institute's briefing. And then on the next slide, so one of the major lessons, as Jake mentioned earlier, is that the Pay for Success, one of the big benefits of a Pay for Success project is that it brings together people to talk about outcomes and to actually look at what's working, what's not, what are we buying, what is actually happening on the ground with the services that we're providing. So another model that the Government Performance Lab has is called active contract management. And active contract management is a high-frequency, data-informed collaboration between providers and a government agency. The idea being that you put together a dashboard with commonly agreed to outcomes metrics that the provider and LASA in this instance, or your government agency, will look at regularly. We recommend monthly, but depending on capacity, it can be every other month or whatever works for your agency. At LASA, we are doing a monthly dashboard review. And based on that dashboard review, we are using that to figure out who we can provide technical assistance to help bring up their outcome performance. And then we're also bringing together LASA with all of our providers based on program type. So rapid rehousing would meet together, bridge and crisis would meet together, et cetera, to look at the dashboard and have an open dialogue about what's going on. You know, it's okay if we don't hit a target, but it's not okay if we don't do anything about it. So if our target is that we want to house 60% of our population into a permanent location using rapid rehousing, and we're not getting there, then we need to try to understand why. And there's no way that the government agency can do that on its own. You need to go out and talk to the providers and understand what's happening on the ground and what are some of the barriers to success. So we're definitely in the early phases of this with LASA. Building out the dashboard definitely took a while, but we finally have one up for rapid rehousing and have started to use it to have conversations with our providers. Next phase is to bring this out to crisis and bridge, and then hopefully other programs that LASA is doing as well. So that's it for my part of the presentation. If you have any other questions, we do have a lot of information on active contract management and our Pay for Success projects on our website, the Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab, if you want to Google that as well. And other than that, I'll turn it back to the supervisor for some Q&A.
Thank you. Excellent. I have some questions I'd like to ask of our panelists. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and lead with those questions, and then maybe we can get everyone else to chime in if you have questions that were not answered. Christy, what motivated Ventura County to pursue Pay for Success strategy?
Well, I think I alluded to some of it. We had a successful program that we were offering to our AB 109 clients that we wanted to make available to the rest of our population. But from a selfish note, my personal interest was that this was a funding opportunity for us to pursue, or we could demonstrate that this is a valid financing strategy so that we could apply it to the very issue that we've been discussing here today.
So what would you say that you know now that you wish you knew when you started down that path?
Well, actually, one of the things that I think, and Jay can back me up on this, is that our grant program is actually relatively small compared to the size of the other programs. It's not that the grant awards were significantly bigger. I think one got $2 million, we got $1.5 million, and somebody else had 500,000, 750,000. But the size of our program overall was less than $3 million. And ironically, I think it's harder to raise funding for smaller sized projects like that than it is for bigger projects. So, you know, when we do this again, right, Jake? When we do this again, we're definitely going to size the program bigger so that we can have bigger impact.
Yeah.
Just to give a bit of color on that last comment, the rationale behind why it's harder for small projects is there's some degree of fixed transaction cost in putting these things together and some degree of headache in putting them together. And both of those things make more sense if you're doing a bigger project.
So would it be fair to say that that's kind of the overhead of the effort of the project, those fixed costs?
Yeah.
And then that would be spread out
Right.
over a larger program the more you.
Exactly.
Okay, it's
Definitely.
a business pro forma, right?
Right.
Daniela, how is the GPL work with LASA similar to or different from the Pay for Success work in Ventura?
Sure. So I think the similarities come in this focus on outcomes and what's happening as far as the major performance metrics that we have decided to target in each of the program components that we have. The major differences is that we don't have a performance contract. I think it would be good to have one, to be honest, but I think that just the timing of when we came in, it just didn't work out to do it from the contracting phase. But it would be nice to have a performance contract that might tie payments to the outcomes, but we don't have that at LASA. We also don't have funders, right? I mean, we don't have this sort of complicated structure of outside funders fronting the money and then the government is paying based on outcomes achieved, which is what a pay for success model is. You know, fortunately, LASA has Measure H money. There's a lot of money coming into the county, and that is helping to fund a lot of the growth and expansion of these projects right now. So we don't have the same funding mechanism. But yeah, I mean, I think the big point of the big similarity is this focus on outcomes and trying to understand, as to the best of our ability, what's working and what's not working on the ground.
You know, I would have to say in my own experience through the years, especially the last 12 years of my city government experience as a council member for the city of Temecula. Temecula is a city that has done very well for itself, has good revenues on a per capita basis, and sort of what that created was sort of a complacency, if you will, about funding programs. And cities have an advantage over counties that I've also noticed. When cities have new impacts to the city and city services, they can oftentimes create a structure that mitigates a lot of that impact. If a new developer comes in and wants to build homes, they've got to pay for roads and schools and most of the services the city has to provide. But what doesn't happen for counties is that, and certainly in Riverside County, and probably many counties are the same way, 2 million of our 2.4 million residents live in cities. And so there are many services the county has to provide to city residents. And yet those services are not mitigated by the growth and the impact fees that are collected by the cities. They're only collecting for the impacts created to the city. It makes for a very challenging budget scenario, I believe, for most counties. And what I have then come to learn, and we've been primarily talking about pay for success and ways to look for measuring outcomes as it relates to homelessness. But wouldn't you say, actually, as we prove this to be an effective method for dealing with homelessness, there's an opportunity for us to actually learn from that and apply it across the board for county services. I think going forward, that should be something we're going to be looking at. This question is for anybody that wants to answer. What are some of the greatest challenges with developing and implementing performance-based contracting strategies, and how do you overcome them?
Christy, what do you
Well, so probably one of the most difficult things to overcome has kind of been the background of a lot of today's conversation. It all has to do with data, right? So unless and until we can actually measure and quantify what it is and then value those outcomes, it's virtually impossible to establish a viable outcomes-based contracting system. So the whole data sharing concept and valuing what those outcomes are, you know, Jake published a paper not too long ago about, is it the wrong dialogue for us to be talking about dollar savings through permanent supportive housing? There's a social benefit to that. And how do you place a value on that? It's what's working and what's not. So I think data sharing and dealing with that is a huge obstacle.
We are here in the Inland Empire, and we consider our partner in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino County. And we had a meeting maybe last fall with one of the members of their team, San Bernardino's team. And he actually stated this, and I'd never heard this before. But he said when we're talking about homelessness, we oftentimes only look at it from a social perspective. And so what we do to combat homelessness, if that's all we're looking at, is to make us feel good about doing something about a social problem or a social ill. But unfortunately, if we're not measuring outcomes, we'll never know if actually the money we're spending in certain areas is actually helping the problem or worsening the problem. And as an example, this individual said he spoke with a friend who worked through a nonprofit in Los Angeles County, and this individual was bragging about how the year before last, on their big soup day, they had fed 750 people. And then last year they fed 1,500 people. And he was touting that as success. and the point this gentleman was making with us was that shouldn't it be going the other way? If you're investing in something to reduce homelessness, shouldn't that number be going down? I thought, wow, that's a great point. And so I think we can approach these social issues also from a pragmatic point of view of where can we get the most out of what we're investing in solving these problems. Yes, Jay.
I fundamentally agree with all of this, and I found that from a technical standpoint, data integration has been the hardest part of the job, right? So working through the data sharing agreements and the culture change needed to do some of this integration is a pain in the butt. But fundamentally, what I think the biggest challenge we face in building performance-based contracts is a fundamental difference in how people view and think about risk, right? Most funders who I work with that are going to be putting up their money at risk of whether or not they're going to achieve outcomes see huge amounts of risk. You know, if they're going to invest in a permanent supportive housing intervention or a cognitive behavioral therapy intervention to reduce recidivism, they see risk everywhere, right? Because they won't get their money back unless they're successful at reducing recidivism. Right. So they look at the studies out there and they see a lot of variability in what happens. They see that the best studies tend to show the lowest impact, right? And they actually see that some providers are doing well and some aren't. Right. So when they're putting their money up, they think, wow, there's a pretty low probability I'm going to get it back. The jurisdictions I work with often see risk in the exact opposite way, right? Many folks think that once you've spent money on something, you're going to get the thing, right? You spend $10 million on homelessness and you've gotten $10 million worth of value. But the reality is that not all interventions work, not all of them work in the way that we think they do, and not all providers are the same level of quality. So that disconnect in how we view risk and how we talk about it is, I would say, the single biggest challenge that we face on a day-to-day basis.
So as an elected at the county level, I would have to say or acknowledge that maybe part of our challenge is to get the decision makers, the policy makers, to understand that we have to massage our perspective, because oftentimes I find that political sensitivities enter into the discussion and oftentimes skew the direction we steer policy, which then create more risk for that individual or that company that wants to try to do something and eliminate as much risk as they can. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's right. I would actually say that, I know I'm on camera, but off the record, to some extent, the pay for success idea is fundamentally about how do you overcome some of the political challenges that face service delivery today? So how do you prospectively set a goal and define how you're going to measure it and how valuable it is, so that it isn't as subject to future machinations, right? Right. It's trying to really publicly say this is the goal we're trying to achieve and how we think we're going to achieve it, and then force us to hold ourselves accountable to that goal. Right?
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Well, and I mean, even on top of that, when you have problems that have long return cycles, right? It's hard to get elected officials with, my term of office is 4 years.
Right.
I'm not going to see the benefit of this intervention for 10 or 12. I mean, with childhood education, for example. You don't see it for years. So it's hard for elected officials to make those kinds of investments today if they're not going to see the return on that investment.
Right. So we need to change that culture.
Right.
Daniela, I think you had something you wanted to add as well.
Yeah, to your question about challenges on performance-based contracting, I would just want to add, I don't necessarily think this is the biggest challenge, but just something else to think about is that when we're doing pay-for-success projects, a lot of times we want to have a randomized control trial so that you can actually see what you want a control group and you want a treatment group so you can actually see the effects, the outcomes, and have something to compare it to. Now, of course, this gets tricky because there are some ethical questions behind it, right? Who gets picked to get a service and who doesn't? Randomized control trials are not always the easiest things to set up. You need to have a good experienced evaluator who is able to do it and able to set it up. And in addition to that, I think that back to the point that Christy was saying earlier, it takes a lot of work to do this, right? And you have to be forward thinking, and a randomized control trial doesn't necessarily give you results today. It's a long, you might have to wait 2 years, 3 years, sometimes even 5 years to really see the results in a randomized control trial. So from the GPL's perspective, we do think a randomized control trial is important, as an important piece of a pay-for-success project, but we also see that as a difficult component to always put together.
Just to be clear, a lot of these things don't have randomized control trials. Out of
Right.
the 110 of them around the world, I think like 9 of them do. They're just all here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone said at one of the earlier panels, as an example of one of the challenges, and I've heard this many times, I'll be speaking with a local council member, and we're talking about what we want to roll out as a program, and they say, well, we only want to help our homeless. And someone had said earlier, right out the gate, when you're asking that homeless person for their address to enter the system, you're almost sabotaging your effort. And so those kinds of things need to be overcome. And something I found myself also saying frequently, much like you take your car in for regular service because intuitively we know if we don't, invariably we're going to be driving on the freeway heading to Ontario for a day-long conference and your car breaks down, right? Unintended consequences or unwanted consequence. So that too sometimes is difficult to convey in a politically charged environment, that this is something we have to do, even if going in we know up front we're not going to see results in 4, 6, 8, 10 years, but it has to be done. I think you've all said that eloquently. My last question, and then I'll open it up if anyone else has questions that have not been answered. What's one thing the people in this room could do to enable higher performing contracting strategies? And each of you maybe throw something in.
So as far as enabling the process, I think it really takes leadership buy-in to make sure that it happens. I think in some places where we've worked, it's been challenging when you work with one person who's very excited, very ready to do the work and take on the challenge. But if the leadership isn't bought in, it's very hard for them to move a project forward because this is a cultural change that we're often asking agencies to take on. So definitely if this is something you want to do, if you want to do performance-based contracts, pay for success, definitely there has to be some sort of leadership buy-in and leadership driving the process.
I think I would say that we are getting a little bit of help from our friends at HUD in this arena when it comes to our continuum of care projects. Because now we are being evaluated on our actual performance of our programs, and
Right.
we are being forced to fund programs that have successful outcomes.
Right.
Somebody earlier had indicated, and I was whispering in Tara's ear on my staff, I said, the example of pre-Hearth Act continuum of care grant funding, where you had the same organizations sitting, controlling the money that were implementing the programs. And so that has totally turned on its head, and now we have an outcomes-based process, which I think is very helpful.
Great.
Can I add one more
Yes,
point
you
also?
can, yeah.
So I know I said leadership buy-in was one thing. I also would argue that provider buy-in is also important. A lot of times providers feel that they get left in the dark when agencies make major changes, and I think that if you can bring them along and get them to buy in and understand why this is happening, it'll make the process a lot easier.
Excellent.
I think this is a process, right? And fundamentally we're talking about mindset and systems change, and that's all well and good. But I am personally impatient. I'm really impatient about this stuff, right? The two things I would say are maybe some of the opposites of what I've been said today, which is there are things that you can do today, and you should do them, and you shouldn't wait, and you should try not to ask permission, right? And try to do what is within your authority today to make sure that the outcomes that are being produced on the ground are more visible and more transparent. So if you are a data owner, find ways of integrating those data with other agencies so that you know who is in the shelter, who is also in the jail, who is also in the ER, right? If you're a data owner and you just have some component of that, find a way so that the providers who you're working with can get access to their own outcomes so they can know if they're doing well, because most of them want to do better, right? If you're not a data owner, try to do your best to, bring a piece of cake to the data owner and, encourage them to be thoughtful about how to do that. And if you're, if you think about the components of what create impact on the ground, right? There's the recipe that you have to follow, the intervention itself. There's the chef, right, which is good providers. And then there's the feedback process, which is like tasting the soup to make sure it's good. Do what you can to make the soup as delicious as possible, right? So if you have a touch point on one of those three, try not to take what is being given, but make it better. Get that feedback process better. Choose the strongest providers and double down on them, or go out and try to shore up that recipe and make it the best one out there.
Great. I'm going to open it up to the floor for any questions, but I want to share something with you. For 25 years, I flew airplanes for Delta, and one of the scenarios I always enjoyed was when we had to push off the gate late for whatever the reason, and we had a great tailwind, and we arrived at our destination still ahead of schedule. That's what we did here with this panel. We left late, and we got here early, and so I'm not going to bemoan that. If there are any other questions left that have not been answered, please chime in. Yes, Bill.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a question. Given the implementation failure risk and the variability that you talked about, if you cut one of these deals and something goes wrong, what does that look like in terms of curing performance before money gets revoked? And then let's say it goes to the point of the funder revoking money or something. How does that wind down work?
Can I take this one?
Great question.
Gabs, you can take this one.
It's a really good question. We spend an enormous amount of time working through that. There are a handful of things I would say. One is the contracts themselves, and they're almost all public, have a pretty extensive termination section. So in lots of different scenarios, there are different kinds of termination and wind down provisions. So it kind of depends on what the scenario is. We try to predict as many of those as possible, right? Does the provider go bankrupt? Does the funder not actually provide funds, or are we unable to raise capital? Does, X, Y, and Z? The short version is, in almost every scenario, providers are being protected, right? So you mentioned funding being revoked. That doesn't happen, right? Because that's not really how the money flows in this case. Funders, the people who are on the hook for the outcomes, are the ones that are providing the money up front, and that is actually funding service provision. So it's not as though they can claw that money back. So once that money's out the door, it's out the door. But the termination itself is actually one of the more complex areas of the contract, and was one of the things that takes a lot of time.
So I want to build off of the comments about cultural change that each of you touched on, and actually Daniela, you hit on a part that I really want to explore just a little bit more and still get us out of there, get out of here so that we can all enjoy that beautiful sunshine out there. That was about providers and bringing them along. So cultural change is really difficult. And what you've all touched on is the challenges of going through significant cultural change in order to improve outcomes. And Riverside has been doing that through the leadership of Supervisor Washington and the partnership with KPMG on a significant scale. Ventura's clearly doing it as well. I'm curious what your strategies have been to bring folks along, particularly the provider community, some of whom may benefit by not having a focus on performance. How do you bring them along to get them engaged so that you can really do what you're setting out to do in terms of improving outcomes in your community?
Well, I think you start with a conversation about, you know, what is the mission and what is the goal, and, you know, how do we best benefit the client, right? I mean, because presumably those organizations, primarily it's NGOs that we're working with, they're mission-driven organizations, and if you are transitioning to outcomes-based and performance-based, you know, if they can prove success by using coordinated entry and various other things, then it makes it easier for them to go do fundraising. That's how we've engaged some of our partners in participating in our coordinated entry system. We said, look, you're going to have data now. You're going to be able to go prove to your donors that you are implementing successful programs. So that's one strategy.
We actually went out and did site visits to all of our providers and spoke to them individually about what we were trying to do. It was, you know, we were trying to get feedback from them. I think by this point we had already decided that we wanted to do this, but we did want to get their insight and feedback to understand, you know, what issues would they see around this? How would it affect their operations? How would it improve their operations? And we try to be as collaborative as possible and really setting the tone that this wasn't meant to be punitive, at least from the active contract management perspective. There wasn't a performance-based contracts. We just want to start the conversation around outcomes. And I think that's a good place to start, right? Whereas I do think performance-based contracts are great and are, you know, really beneficial to an organization. If you're worried about providers and the way they might react, maybe we don't start with a performance-based contract. Maybe we start with something like active contract management, where we can start looking at outcomes and having conversations. And I think just making sure that any conversation you have about data with your providers comes from a place of we're trying to understand what's going on the ground. So if you're not hitting your outcome, like I said earlier, it's okay, but we need to do something about it. So we need to work with you to understand how we make that happen.
Wouldn't add much, except to say that I think no one benefits from poor performance or from, you know, worse outcomes, right? And these are mission-driven organizations. The only things that they may push back against, you know, sorry, if I were to step back just a little bit, we got into this idea because nonprofit leaders came to us saying, we have two very different jobs, right? One is to go out and do the things we say we're going to do, and the other one is to go out and find money to do those things, and those things hardly, if ever, overlap, right? So most of the, certainly of the more sophisticated nonprofits that come to us are really excited about the idea of performance-based contracting. It means that their leaders don't spend 60% of their time fundraising, right? They spend that time trying to make their organization as strong as possible. It means that they often get long-term runways, right? These things are often 3 or 5 or 7 years. And it means that they get full cost accounting, right? So investors would never lowball a provider because they really want to get the outcomes. So they actually get a lot of benefit from it. The pushback is, are you measuring performance appropriately and accurately? And that's a real question, right? Because it's easy to mess that up. So I think that's often where we get some pushback from providers, and I think very reasonably so.
And that's just to add on. We didn't do this with LASA because LASA already had some performance outcomes written into their contracts. But in other jurisdictions where the GPL has piloted active contract management, we actually did about a 4-month process with the providers where we talked about outcomes and decided what we were going to track on a regular basis. So bringing the providers into those conversations as well, so that they really feel like they're partners in this and not someone who's being monitored and, you know, that it's all compliance focused. Bringing them in, even from the stage where you're building out outcomes, I think really helps to build that relationship.
Great point. All right. Well, that's all I've got. Graham, unless you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
No, but please all join me in thanking the panel and Supervisor Washington for moderating.